Liverpool, one of the largest cities in the United Kingdom, with a population of 500,000, is famous worldwide today for its culture, music, and industrial heritage. As a port city, it grew as an important centre for mercantile trade, its docks also being a point of departure for Irish immigrants to North America, many of whom chose to settle in the city. It was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution that Liverpool achieved global importance in the 19th century, with, for example, the first intercity, Liverpool to Manchester, railway, the Royal Albert Dock as the first non-combustible warehouse, and a pioneering elevated electrical railway. In the 19th century, much of world trade passed through the city's docks. In fact, so prosperous had Liverpool become through importing goods like cotton that, at times, it was more wealthy than London. Despite the acclaim of being described as a world city and the New York of Europe by one newspaper in 1886, as well as technological innovations and the splendour of its civic buildings, rapid population growth, alongside the construction of cheap and squalid housing, inflicted a terrible price on the health of dock workers, labourers and their families, who called Liverpool home. It was, perhaps, the epitome of a gloomy Victorian novel, a heart of darkness, according to the novelist J.B. Priestley, in words he used to describe it in later years. According to one of the city's late Victorian charity workers, the misery was worse than any town in the United Kingdom, except, perhaps, Glasgow. Today, in an account by the Victorian journalist and social explorer Robert Sherard, we journey into the heart of Liverpool slums at the turn of the 20th century to discover the appalling depths of poverty and desperate living conditions faced by the city's poor. Sherard resolved to expose squalor with a view to improving people's lives. He started out on his journey dressed in working-class clothes, living in modest lodgings, eating the same food as everyday people, and obtaining his information largely from the very people who were suffering appalling living conditions. Find out how, in the slums around Limekiln Lane and Toxteth Park, wives and mothers already struggling to make ends meet, while husbands were away at sea, were impoverished yet further by having to borrow money from lenders at extortionate rates. Some were so poor that starvation was not uncommon, their meal for the day being no more than a simple drink of tea. And for all this suffering, they had to endure the further evils of living in filthy, vermin-infested courts, awaiting the day when the slums would finally be condemned. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us continue bringing the past alive. It was near Drinkwater Gardens that I was told that the man who could tell me more about poverty in Liverpool than anybody was Mr. Jones, of the Food and Betterment Association, whom I should find living in the heart of the slums, up Limekiln Lane, off Scotland Road. The man's name should be known throughout the kingdom for the admirable work he is doing. He devotes his life to the Liverpool poor. He works among them for 14 hours every day of the week, and draws for their needs even on his slender purse. He has the face of discipline, the manners and conversation of a polished gentleman. Primarily, the object of the Food and Betterment Association is to supply the poor, especially poor children, with halfpenny meals of soup and bread. Upwards of 150 gallons of excellent soup are thus distributed every day, the loss being about a penny on each meal. I was present while distribution was in progress, and, introduced by Miss Rogers of the association, who afterwards piloted me into the awful houses I visited that afternoon, thus made the acquaintance of Mrs. Jones, Robsart Street, who pays 2 shillings and 6pence a week for one room, and whose husband earns about 3 shillings a week by doing all the street sweeping he can get to do. About 1 day's work a week. He's getting old, said Mrs. Jones, and they want to get shut of him. Also, to a respectable-looking old man who had once been a bookkeeper in a good position. His name is Dixon, and he lives in Pembroke Place. He is 76 years of age, too old to find any employment, and he has 1 shilling a week to live on, the parish paying his rent. He comes all the way to Limekiln Lane every day for his 1 meal, because it's the best value he can get for a halfpenny in Liverpool. 76, a respectable, decent old man, and 1 halfpenny meal a day. But there are deeper depths. For instance, here is Mrs. Williams of Court 31 in Hornby Street. We find her supping a saucer of milkless tea, and when we ask her if she has had any food, she says, yes, she has had a cup of tea. A broken table and a wooden bench are the main furniture of Mrs. Williams' home. A black cat before the fire, who can eat and digest offal, looks less starved than its mistress, who, with her husband and 2 children, has for weeks to depend on the charity of the soup kitchen. Mr. Williams is a steady man and a strict teetotaler. He tries for a living at the docks. When he can get work, he earns 4 shillings 6pence a day, but is often weeks and months without work. On the occasion of our visit, he had been out for 3 weeks. The fire was made up of coke, begged off street sweepers. Mrs. Williams shared her house and the rent of 3 shillings 6pence with Mrs. Brannan, who had also dined that day off a saucer of tea. Both women were in rags, and were undoubtedly starving. In number 3 house, 14th Court, in the neighbouring Tatlock Street, a woman died recently of starvation. This house is in the occupation of Mrs. Conroy, who shelters a Mrs. Jones, and shares the rent with another young woman. Mrs. Jones is a widow, and earns nothing at all, but runs messages for neighbours occasionally. She sleeps on the floor, in the downstairs room, which is also Mrs. Conroy's bedroom, kitchen, and parlour. Mrs. Conroy's husband is a sailor on a coasting vessel, and is away a fortnight or 3 weeks at a time. In his absence, she lives on 1 shilling a day, which she gets from a money-lending woman, a fish dealer in Penryn Street. When Mr. Conroy returns and draws his wages, he repays the shillings, with 3 halfpence interest on each shilling. It works out at about 2,000%. The same moneylender keeps Mrs. Conroy's fellow tenant going at the same rate. Her father is also at sea. The ceiling above Mrs. Conroy's bed was broken in many places and appended. The room above, where only 3 persons slept on the floor, was without furniture of any kind, beyond a heap of rags, with the bedding in a corner. The walls were covered with black marks. "Bugs," said Mrs. Jones. "The house swarms with them." "It is the same in all these houses," said Miss Rogers. "The rent is 3 shillings. Mrs. Conroy was in bed when we called. "I have been ailing for months, in fact," she said. "I've never been well since my brother-in-law bit my ear off." And so saying, she turned her face and showed that her left ear had been snapped off to the root. The brother-in-law was the husband of the woman who died of starvation, and it was during some quarrel after this event, about the funeral money, that this occurred. "I cried murder," said Mrs. Jones, "and the neighbours rushed in, and the fellow, he then spat the ear out there on the floor, and the doctor found it, and produced it in court, and waggled it in the faces of the jury. 4 months he got for that job." Of the utterly wretched condition of all these houses in these noisome slums, with their tumble-down staircases, their filth and vermin and stench, of the midden-like courts on which they open, with their common latrines, pestilential and foul, it is perhaps unnecessary to speak. All this area has been condemned, and is coming down by and by. In the meanwhile, human beings have to live here, and the rents are rigorously exacted from starving women. The money, or I'll bailiff you," is the landlord's Monday greeting. One wonders where all these swarms of people will migrate to when the houses do come down, those which are being put up in other areas, in the place of slum dwellings, are let at rentals far beyond the means of these people. Some days before my visit to Liverpool, Mr. Jones was informed that a woman was in a very bad way in 7 Court, Blenheim Street. Here he found Mrs. Martin, who is the wife of a dock labourer in casual employment, and the mother of 5 children. She had been lying without food for 24 hours. During the last 3 weeks her husband, who is a very steady man, had only been able to earn 8 shillings. He goes to the docks every day, but most times has to return hence at nights without having found any work. She was lying in bed in her filthy room, a picture of desolate maternity. Another woman was crouching over the tiny fire. A little girl rolled on the floor. The windows were all cracked. A portrait of Lord Robert supplied a missing pane, and looked out on such a sight as God grant may never shock his kindly eyes. I asked Mrs. Martin if she could tell me what her average income, week in, week out, might be, with her husband's occasional jobs and the bit she can earn going out with her basket. She has about 1 shilling a day for the 7 of them. Mrs. Barnes, in Court 11, who has the upstairs room at a rent of 1 shilling 6pence a week, has nothing at all, and the principal tenant, who has about 2 shillings 6pence a week to live on with her family, doesn't see how Mrs. Barnes proposes to pay her rent. And as I tell her, it's no use her coming here if she can't produce the 1 shilling 6pence. Certainly, bailiffing Mrs. Barnes would be a waste of time and energy, for the only chattel in her room, apart from a heap of rags in one corner, was an orange box. On this was set out a knife without a handle, a syrup tin as a drinking vessel, a tin plate, and a piece of muddy bread, evidently picked from the gutter. In one corner was a foul-smelling heap of rubbish, including a single boot. Here Mrs. Barnes lives and has her being, lying on the floor. From Mrs. Barnes's home we walked to an adjoining street, where Miss Rogers introduced me to an old Irish cobbler and his wife, who a few days previously had been burned out of their cottage. The wife, in leaping from the bedroom window, had broken her arm. The husband had lost all his tools and stock, and the pair had been found, in their night attire, sitting at 3 o'clock on a wet morning on the curb of the street. In the destruction of his home the cobbler had lost his savings of a few shillings, and though, thanks to the efforts of Mr. Jones, a temporary home and a few indispensable articles of furniture had been provided for this most worthy and respectable couple, a terrible difficulty for the future stared them in the face. The man was willing and able to work, and could earn his 18 or 20 shillings a week, but in the whole district he could not find a single landlord to take him in, the objection being to the plying of his trade. Failing his being able very shortly to find a place where he could work, his disabled wife and himself would have to go to the workhouse. In most towns, when a beggar asks you in the street for bread, one rightly interprets this as a veiled appeal for money or beer. When Mrs. Barnes asks you in Liverpool of a wet night if you happen to have some bread in your pocket, she means literally what she says. The first appeal in these terms was made to me by a ragged woman, who had 2 babies in her arms, whom I found sitting on the steps of the Liverpool Public Library. I was about to make some jocular retort when I caught sight of the woman's face. Looking closer at the squalid group, it became apparent to me that these people were undoubtedly in want of bread. Watching the woman, later, I saw her appeal to various workmen slouching home, and on several occasions with success. The ragged labourer, some wretched casual dock labourer, would stop and turn out his pockets and hand over a mouldy crust. This would be devoured on the spot. No doubt the piece of bread I had seen laid on Mrs. Barnes's one piece of furniture, the broken orange box, had been obtained in this way, from the charity of some poor fellow who never had enough bread for himself. For, as Bulwer Lytton says, it is only those who are half-starved who relieve the starving. My visit to the public library, on the occasion referred to, was to consult a series of 14 articles which appeared some time ago in a Liverpool newspaper, dealing with Liverpool slum life, or the damned before death. The articles were detailed and dramatic, but I noticed that the authors attributed the misery of these awful districts almost entirely to the abuse of drink. I do not think that the writers are fair to these poor people, said Miss Rogers, as we continued our walk in the purlieus of Lime Kiln Lane. "As you know, none of the people whom you have visited, and whose dreadful stories you have heard, are drunkards. Many indeed are strict teetotalers. No, the causes of the misery are the overpopulation of Liverpool and the instability of employment. The disgraceful housing of the very poor adds to the horror of their lives." And indeed I may say that she was right. The want of bread, not the excess of beer, is the reason of Liverpool's most bitter cry. During that afternoon's walk, piloted by the gracious and beautiful lady of the Food and Betterment Association, who has given up a life of luxury and refinement in Paris to devote herself to the pariahs of murky Liverpool, I visited many homes such as I have described, and heard stories which are but a dreary repetition of those that I have quoted. Perhaps it was in Penryn Street that I saw the worst courts and houses, and noted the most appalling sanitary conditions. Noted here, in a group of ragged children, a poor little girl, shaking with fever, coughing up her lungs with a dismal whoop. Here also the woodchoppers were at work, seated for the most part on the filthy curbs, labouring in the rain for the fewest of pence. It was in Penryn Street also that it was most vividly impressed on me what excellent work the Food and Betterment Association is doing. Many entire families here subsisted for weeks together on the doles of its soup kitchen, whilst the occasional concerts which it organises in the worst courts are eagerly remembered. "When are you coming again?" was asked of Miss Rogers repeatedly, in a court where the last concert was given more than a year ago. "It was as good as the sunlight," said one woman, who poked a haggard head out of the door of a vault-like cellar. She was making her dinner by pouring some hot water into an old jam-pot in which there were a few tea-leaves. "The misery in Liverpool," said Mr. Jones as I took leave of him at his office, "is worse than any town in the United Kingdom, except, perhaps, Glasgow." As I was returning townwards, I passed at the bottom of Lime Kiln Lane a magnificent building on which were the words, "The Bevington House Hotel." It is a lodging-house for workmen, appointed and managed in the same way as the Rowton houses in London. The same evening I met a man in a public house in Blair Street, who told me that he lived there, and described its comforts, as compared to those of the common doss-house, in such terms that I abandoned a project I had formed of seeking shelter there. The object of my visit to Blair Street was to view some of the awful courtyards of the Toxteth Park area, and notably a home where last year, according to the Liverpool Review, a neglected baby had died in the absence of its mother. This home I was unable to find, though a friendly scuffer policeman did his best to assist. Yet I heard and saw and smelt enough that night to convince myself that the Toxteth Park district can vie in squalor and wretchedness with the worst part of the Lime Kiln Lane area.